Thank you very much, Roger. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be sharing in this important occasion for the Police Foundation. I was myself a trustee of the Foundation for a while, but moved on to other things about 3 or 4 years ago. I'm delighted to see the Foundation moving on, and especially the news, which I did already know, but is really very welcome news, that the Police Foundation has received this money, which will enable it to do this really very exciting piece of research in the 2 towns that you've heard about. I've been asked to talk about policing in a changing world, and I'll do my best. The problem is, I've got half an hour, and the world has changed rather a lot in the last 30, 40, 50 years. I'm going to try and skim through 5 sections in half an hour. The first section will just introduce some basic data about our changing world, and then, as you can see, I'll move on to a number of specific issues. So starting with the basic data, I'd like to follow up the theme that's already been introduced about change over quite a long period. The last Royal Commission on the Police was in 1962, produced its report in 1962, 50 years ago next year. It was quite an interesting report. It was quite worried about the impact on the police of the increasing number of motorists and the fact that this brought a different clientele in touch with the police than had traditionally been the case. At that time, the police had no radios. Think about that. The police had no radios in 1962. They were introduced actually in 1963. There were 125 police forces. And to throw in a slightly different point, one of the offences that the police prosecuted, and they did sometimes prosecute it, was consensual homosexual activity by males in private, which was still an offence. So a completely different world 50 years ago. So let's have a look in slightly more detail at some of the changes that have happened over this sort of period. Here's the population over the period since 1951. The figure down here, there's an overall 20% increase in the population of the UK since 1951, quite a significant increase. Much of that increase is through more births than deaths. Of course, people are living longer. But here on the right-hand column, you have the net migration change in thousands per annum. And you'll see that actually, I didn't realize this until I looked this up. The increase in migration is very sharp, especially in the last decade. And that ties up with what John's just said about what's happening in Slough. We are, of course, a much more ethnically diverse society than we were a few years ago. These were the figures on the right-hand side, percentages in 2005. Still, this is England only, but still very predominantly white British, but with very significant proportions of different ethnic groups. And of course, this is an important issue in society generally. One of the other slides that I really rather like is the proportion of different ethnic groups who consider themselves to be British. The left-hand side gives you what they self-describe as their ethnic group, and then the bars tell you whether what proportion of people who self-identify in these ethnic groups say that they are British, English, Scottish, or Welsh. I think this is an extremely reassuring slide because very large proportions of most of the main ethnic groups say that they are British. So there is no sense of a fragmented society that feels it is not British. There is a sense of Britishness, although there is also a diversity. The bit I really like in this slide is that the group who feel themselves to be least British are the white Irish at 20%, as you can see. We're also a more educated population. These are the percentages of students in further education moving from 1970 to 2005. Huge increases in further education, then in the middle, undergraduate higher education, and then at the bottom, postgraduate higher education. We're also a more scattered population. Average household size has decreased by half a person during the last 30 years. And I'd like to draw your attention especially to the top row, the markedly increasing proportion, these are percentages, the markedly increasing proportion of people living alone under the state pension age, gone up from 6% to 15%, a big increase. And that's despite the fact that more people, of course, are living longer. So there is a small increase in people in one-person households over the pension age, but the big increase is in the younger one-person households. And then in the area of marriage, marriage has become less popular, and partnerships have largely replaced them, or at least to an extent replaced them, although divorces have also increased, another important social change during this period. So that's just a few more canapes to tell you about some changes that have been occurring. Now I want to get into some theory. Now whenever an academic gets into theory, there's always a danger that people's eyes start glazing over and they say, what on earth is he on about? What is the point of doing some theory? The point of doing theory is that, as you've already grasped this morning, this is a very complex, kaleidoscopic change. So we need to get some sort of a grip on this change and to understand it through some sort of spectacles. That's what theory is. That's all that theory is. It's a way of using some spectacles to produce some order into this kaleidoscopic range of facts about change. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite diagrams, which is Anthony Giddens, Lord Giddens, formerly director of the London School of Economics. And this is a book he wrote in 1990 called The Consequences of Modernity. And this is about the changes in the environments of trust as between pre-modern and modern societies. Now, we need a bit of explanation here. According to sociologists, modernity began around the time of the Industrial Revolution, or maybe a bit before. So it's to be distinguished from the medieval period and so on. Modernity has, according to Giddens, some very special features. He argues, and I agree with him, that what we've been witnessing in the last 50 years or so is a process of late modernity. That is to say, modernity speeded up. So in order to understand late modernity, we need to understand what modernity is and to understand its differences from pre-modernity. So let's have a go at that. Left-hand side, the key bit is the bit immediately under the main heading, the pre-modern. In pre-modern societies, hanging on for a long time into modern society, the general context is the overriding importance of localized trust. And as you can see, the idea is that you grow up in a village, maybe, or a small town. Kinship relations are vital. You are a member of the extended Smith family. The local community as a place is vital, religious cosmology and tradition. Tradition is central to that because tradition is linked very much to culture, and there's a very thick culture in those kinds of pre-modern societies, and culture consists of patterns, explicit and implicit, of and for behavior, transmitted by symbols. The essential core consists of traditional ideas and the values attached to them. So People grew up in a culture that surrounded them in a specific place with families around them belonging to a particular set of religious values and so forth. That is what pre-modern society is all about. Now, I'm told it's... Can we go back one, whoever's doing the AV? Thank you. If we go back to the modern, what changes in the modern is that trust relations gradually move away from localized trust and they become vested in disembedded abstract systems. Giddens's example is getting on an aeroplane. When you get on an aeroplane, you don't trust the familiar localized place. You trust the pilot's training, the air traffic control system, and so on and so forth. You can fill in the rest. It's a series of abstract systems which enable you to feel that you'll be safe and get to the other end safely. In that kind of context, different sorts of things start to happen to your personal relationships. So personal relationships become less localized, less embedded in culture, and more a matter of personal choice. That's the first dimension there. But I want particularly to draw attention to the difference between tradition over here and future-oriented perspectives over here. In the past, in pre-modern societies, hanging on until quite a late point, the past is a very good guide to the future. That is no longer the case. If you are running the police foundation or a particular police service or BT or whoever, you do not say, right, this is the way this organization has been working for the last 10 years. It's been working successfully. Therefore, we must continue to do exactly what we've been doing in the last 10 years. You do not do that because we are living in a world of constant change. So what you do, you go, usually you have an away day in a hotel somewhere, you take all your stuff away, and you say to them, right, I want you to think into the future. I want you to project into the future. And I want you to think about how this company, this organization, this university, this police service, what challenges it might face in 10 years' time, how are we going to become lean and mean and blah, to fit those challenges. Yes, you recognize this scenario. That is exactly what Giddens is describing. He's saying what we do, we're now trusting the future. We're setting up scenarios and then trying to move towards those scenarios. And the past becomes less and less a guide to the future. Now, I'd like you to notice that that is actually very, very similar to what scientists do. Scientists produce hypotheses and then they test them. And what we are seeing here is one of the key dynamics of modernity. Science is central to the growth of modernity and late modernity, and all that technology that Stuart talked about is exactly predicated on that. And what we do in science, and social science come to that, is project hypotheses. The posh name for them is counterfactuals, things that aren't currently factual, but we'll think about them as potentially factual. And then you test whether that counterfactual might be true. And in the same way, that's what businesses and all those things do as they create business plans, strategy plans, and so forth. So what that then does is produces, if you think about how the process of moving from the left-hand column to the right-hand column, what happens is that as that process gains strength, which according to Giddens, and I agree with him, has accelerated in the last 50 years, what that produces then is faster and faster and faster change. So we're living in a world of constant change. And this is quite unsettling in some ways, because in the left-hand world, everybody, as it were, knew their place. They might not have liked it too much if they were at the bottom of the heap, socially speaking. but they knew their place and they expected to stay in that place for a long time. Now, all of that is up for grabs, and we are being asked to, as it were, create ourselves. And there's a number of sociologists have written about this. Zygmunt Bauman, for example, I don't want you to worry too much about the exact terminology, but he prefers liquid modernity to late modernity. It really doesn't matter. But he says, and this is a quote from a book on him, that solid modernity has gradually been transformed. Liquid modernity entails living without an ultimate perfect model of society. Individual life reflects the experience of being in an increasingly deregulated, flexible world, a world full of uncoordinated, often contradictory chances and voices, devoid of clear-cut standards. Now, that might be slightly exaggerated, but you can see what he's saying about the difference from the previous situation. And, as many sociologists have pointed out, what this also produces is an increasing individualism as you get disembedded, to use the technical term, from those original settled cultures. We are all required, as it were, to make our own way in the world, and the italicized bit says what each of us is increasingly called upon to do within the framework of globalizing social processes, on which more in a second, is to reshape, reconstruct, reinvent, and transfigure ourselves. Ours is the age of the new individualism. Right. So moving on quickly to economic developments, because of course the world has changed hugely economically as well in the last 50 years. I'd like to show you first of all a graph about growth. This is from 1981 to 2006, 25-year period. And this is, as you'll see if you can read the footnote, this is adjusted to 2006 prices. So this is adjusted for inflation, so this is, as it were, real money. And the way it works is it's in pounds per week on the left-hand side, so at a fixed level of price. The median for the population as a whole has gone up from just over 200 to just under 400. In other words, in a 25-year period, we have got significantly richer, on each of us on average, by about 1.5 times. And that is a process that has been going on since the Second World War. And that is actually a marked difference from the situation between the two world wars, when we had genuine boom and slump, when there was not continuous growth. And precisely the anxiety in the current economic situation is that people, not least the Chancellor of the Exchequer, are worried that this process of continual growth might come to an end. And given the current economic developments, it is actually possible that the current economic growth might come to an end. And if economic growth comes to an end, what then? Well, we don't really know, because for the last 50 years we've been living with continual growth. And if we go into a double-dip recession, then, you know, all the bets are off, I think, and what the social consequences will be, I don't know. That's for workshops, not for me. But it's something to think about. But also, while we're at it, looking at this slide, the median growth has gone up all the time, but look at what's happened to the top 10% of incomes and the bottom 10% of incomes. They've all gone up. Even the bottom 10% has increased slightly, so everybody is slightly better off, but the gap between rich and poor is hugely greater than it was, and this is not just happening in this country, it is a universal phenomenon in most Western societies. So a big factor there of continual growth and increasing divergence between rich and poor. Let's have a quick look at some of the changes in the nature of capitalism over the last 50 years. Globalization, you know all about. Growth of multinational corporations. National governments are less able to control their economies. I am now a pensioner, and I can remember a time when I went abroad in the 1960s, you actually, some of you might possibly be able to remember this, you actually had on the back of you, at the end of your passport, you had a bit where you had to say how many pounds you were taking out of the country, even on an ordinary boring trip to France. People were trying to control exchanges even at that very tiny level. They've completely given up on that, of course, because of the technology, which means that money sloshes around the world all the time. This is globalization. We have got used to living with it. Globalization, unfortunately, has also come to people involved in crime. So, as chief constables know too well, we have cross-border organized crime dealing with things like people trafficking, the drugs trade, and money laundering. And one of the things that I hope that the Police Foundation research in Slough and Luton will deal with is that, because I know that there is a degree of people trafficking and so on that is linked to those towns. But we really don't know as criminologists, perhaps the police do, but we don't have it, as it were, in an organized form. We really don't know much about the relationship between organized crime and local crime. And I hope very much that that's something that we will develop in the next few years, perhaps through the Police Foundation project. The next one, we've switched from a producer-oriented capitalism to a consumer-oriented capitalism. If you have continual growth, this means you have to persuade people to buy things. And you have to persuade people to buy things that they didn't actually know they wanted before you persuaded them to buy it. All of us have, I imagine, unless you're extremely strong-willed, will have bought something that you didn't really need and subsequently wondered why you had bought it. That is, of course, a phenomenon that the entrepreneurs are delighted that is happening. My favorite example is trainers. I remember when trainers came in, I think in the 1980s. Before that, we had gym shoes, which some of you are too young to remember. But gym shoes were very boring. Trainers are now not only, well, they are better, it has to be said, than gym shoes, but not only are they better, they're also, quotes, quotes, a fashion statement. And which particular design of trainers you buy says something about you, apparently. Similarly with cars and so on. So we begin to acquire an identity based in part on what we wear, the car we drive, and so on. And so the phrase designer dresses did not exist 30 years ago, and now it's everywhere, and it's because, to an extent, our identities have become linked to particular fashion products, again, to the delight of the entrepreneurs. These things have been going on, and what that produces is this, that if you compare household expenditure in the current period and index it back to 1971, so that each of these is indexed to, in 1971 they were all 100, and this is what they are now. And so the average is we're now spending 2.5 times what we were in 1971. And now look at the differences. Things like BT will be delighted that the top of the list is communications. At 1,000, that's 10 times the average. Whereas down the bottom, food and housing, water, fuel, the necessities, if you like, have grown less fast than the luxuries. The tourist expenditure abroad, recreation, and communications have increased the fastest. That's an inevitable product of the switch from a producer economy to a consumer economy. Can I go back again, please? Hello, audio-visual people. Can you go back a slide, please? Thank you. We also have less dependence on specific places for raw materials, water, and so on. What that produces is a decline of trade union influence because entrepreneurs can move their businesses much more readily. It also, of course, produces some pressure on governments because governments are met by large companies who say, well, if you don't give us what we want in the way of taxes or whatever, we will simply move somewhere else. So we've got a much more flexible economy, and people are doing more outsourcing and so on. It's all part of the increasing fragmentation that we're living in. And finally, I spent 16 years of my life in Sheffield, and since I moved to the south, I have noticed that people in the south don't really understand, quite frankly, the impact of deindustrialization. But if you live in the north, in Sheffield, Manchester, Leeds, Sunderland, Newcastle, whatever, deindustrialization is a very important fact of life. The old industries have been stripped out by competition from countries with cheaper labor, and this has produced a need to reinvent the city in a new guise. Often, it has to be said, through the public sector, and that produces particular problems in the current situation. Yesterday, I heard a snippet of a bit by Digby Jones on Radio 4, where he talked about the continual challenges we face economically, and he said the only way forward is to make sure your population is fully skilled. Fine, but you're never going to make sure that all of your population is fully skilled. And I've just been finishing a piece of research on some recidivist offenders aged in their early 20s, most of whom have no skills at all and therefore are almost useless in the labour market. And that's not a very sensible way of thinking about how we deal with recidivist offenders. If recidivist offenders are actually unable to get work because we're moving towards a more skilled economy, then what? Then we've got a bit of a social problem that we have to deal with. Okay. I'm running out of time. John is glaring at me, but I will move quickly on to my last two sections. In the politics sphere, the growing individualization that we've seen produces two key developments, has produced, in my view, two key developments. The first one is the development of a human rights agenda, which goes right back to the European Convention immediately after the Second World War. The European Convention was put in place for extremely sensible reasons because of the abuses of human rights that we saw during the Second World War. What the human rights agenda also does is it protects people from the oppressions that they had during some of the communitarian phase that we saw on the left-hand side of Giddens's diagram. So it has to be said that in the communitarian phase, women got a pretty raw deal, and ethnic minorities got a very raw deal. And so we have a human rights agenda that says we need to take account of people as individuals and make sure that everyone has equal opportunities. Absolutely right. But notice it's part of the individualizing agenda. But now, of course, some particularly on the political right, are to be heard saying, well, it's time to scrap the human rights agenda, or at least to modify it. Why are they saying that? Because of a different kind of individualism, which has now become much more powerful, which is normally called neoliberalism. And this kind of neoliberalism treats the state with a good deal of suspicion. And it really wants an absolutely minimalist state. And it wants, as far as possible, to look at what the state provides, particularly where this is outside the state's absolutely core agenda of defense and so on. It wants to look at what the state provides simply as a series of services. And once you start looking at them as a series of services, then in an era of capitalism and of increasing reliance on the market, which is what we've seen in the last decades, then you also start saying, well, okay, let's start privatizing a lot of these services. And that is exactly what we've seen happen. And there's an interesting book by Philip Bobbitt called The Shield of Achilles, where he talks about, there's only one chapter that's relevant, the rest is largely about foreign policy, but it's a brilliant chapter. And he calls it, he doesn't call it neoliberalism, he calls it the new market state. And he talks about the new market state as an emerging constitutional order that promises to maximize the opportunities of its people, tending to privatize many state activities and make representative government more responsive to the market. And then there's this wonderful comment, which is so true. In the era of the nation state, read the welfare state, the state took responsibility for the welfare of groups, hence education, hence the National Health Service, etc. In the market state, the dominant criterion that begins to emerge is maximizing choice. So choice becomes the key word. And of course, once you say choice is the key word, you start thinking about privatization, because you're immediately thinking about the market and the choices that go with the market. Sometimes this is done in rather strange ways and producing choices that people didn't frankly really want. My favorite example is when we got rid of the perfectly adequate, as far as I was concerned anyway, single service of directory inquiries, and we said, you can all have a choice as to which company you ring up for your directory inquiries. And so now, as you know, there are lots of choices. Whether people make an informed choice as to which directory inquiry company they use is, I would have thought, pretty much open to question. And that what that shows you, actually, is that the choice agenda is not necessarily about what consumers want. It sometimes is, but it's not necessarily about that. It's also driven by the general ideology of the market state, of marketizing the state. And a final comment that Bobbitt makes, which is really interesting, he says, there will be more public participation in government, think police commissioners, but it will count for less, will it? And the role of citizen as citizen will decrease, and the role of citizen as spectator will increase. What's he on about? Think about Big Brother. In Big Brother, people participate in evictions, sort of. They all have votes, but are they really participating in the program, or are they acting as spectators and then sort of mildly influencing what's going on in the show? That's the contrast that Bobbitt is trying to draw here, that citizens maybe are just spectators, occasionally indicating their views, rather than really participating in what is going on in their society. The final section, and I really have run out of time, and since there's going to be a workshop on this, I'm going to say very little about it, but I am going to say something about it. This is Insecurity and Incivilities. Giddens, remember, talked about an increasing insecurity His words are actually ontological insecurity. That is, an insecurity that comes to the root of your being, an ontological insecurity that is created by this much more fragmented society. And we all know that one of the things that happens when we ask in surveys about what people think are threats in their local areas, this is what you get. This is a slide produced originally by Martin Innes, who I'm delighted to see in the audience. Thank you for the slide, Martin. I've used it lots of times. Across the top are 6 wards in 6 different boroughs, and A, B, C, D, E, F. And on the left-hand side, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So in Ward A, people said drugs were the most significant threat to their local sense of security. And secondly, youth hanging around. Thirdly, assault. Fourthly, burglary, and so on. These were the things that made them feel unsafe, insecure as they went about their daily business. It's really interesting. Of course, it varies by area, but the really interesting thing is, have a look at burglary. Burglary never appears higher than 4th. But the stuff at the top, drugs, graffiti, litter, public urination, vandalism, damage, youths hanging around, etc., it's all things that are happening in public space. We all have to use public space, and in this society where we don't know people, if people behave uncivilly in public space, this makes us feel insecure. There's a recent Ipsos Mori survey which says that doesn't mean that the police should prioritize these things above burglary and robbery. It does mean, according to the Ipsos Mori poll, that people want the police, first of all, to deal with serious crimes, but also to take these things seriously. And one of the reasons why they want it to take them seriously, and the evidence on this is really only beginning to emerge, is that these things, and I could go in more into this if you like, but these things are actually much more often, these incivilities are much more often repeated than are typical crimes. And there is good data on this now. So the incivilities in public space are much more often repeated. And there's a wonderful quote in one of Martin Innes's, and he's the big guru on incivilities, and I'm delighted that he's leading a workshop on that today. There's a wonderful quote from somebody in one of his articles where somebody says, "Yes, I know that murder and rape are more serious crimes, but it's graffiti that I see when I go out of my front door. It's in my face every day." So there's this sense of my area is out of control because there's this wretched graffiti and it's constantly being renewed and it gets me down and it's repeated. So there's that sort of sense. And that is important because it's, Martin argues, and I think he's right, although it's a complicated argument that we don't have time to get into here, that this growth of incivilities is related to the changes of late modernity that I've been talking about. Assuming that is right, what that means is that the police are in a really quite difficult situation. Here they are in a globalized world having to deal with increasing amounts of organized crime on a transnational basis, and therefore having to look in a very wide compass, but simultaneously finding people really very concerned about very minor things going on their doorsteps. And that, in a nutshell, is the central challenge for the police in a late modern society. Thank you.